Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the world. My name is Zach Jones, although I know a lot of you probably already know who I am. Welcome back to my channel, but if you're new to my channel, then welcome. As I mentioned previously, I am reshooting a few old PowerPoints, but this time, before I do any more on that, I'm going to do a new PowerPoint. This one is about falconry. Now, falconry was, particularly in the medieval era, the sport of hunting, and of course, back in those days you couldn't go down to the supermarket and get your food wrapped in clingfilm or tinfoil. You had to hunt for it, and one of the ways we did that was by using birds of prey. Falconry, as I said, it is a sport of hunting, because back then you had to hunt for meat, but there was also a very strict hierarchy of who could fly who, but I'll get to that a bit later. I mean, it originally started in Asia and the Middle East and slowly moved over to Europe. Of course, it was very popular among nobles like knights, squires, kings, and all that. Of course, falconry is still done today, and of course I will get to that bit later. Of course, for now, I'll tell you all the basics. Now, the most common birds that were flown in falconry were the goshawk and the peregrine falcon. Now, both birds are still flown today, but the goshawk is a one-man hunting bird and it can be quite a stressful bird, so it does not fly in displays. But there was a hierarchy of who could fly who. There were kings, earls and princes, knights, ladies of the court, yeomen and priests, and of course the servants, or the knaves, which were at the bottom. Of course, these two were the birds that were most commonly flown in falconry, the goshawk and the peregrine falcon. Now, whoever flew the goshawk was a very lucky man, and I will explain on that later, but of course the peregrine was flown by the squire and the prince, but I'll also talk about that later. As I mentioned, there was a very strict hierarchy of who could fly what, and I'm going to tell you all about that now. Now, there was the kestrel, which is a very common bird of prey. Now, the kestrel was flown by the knave, who was usually like a servant or a peasant. Of course, the kestrel is quite a small bird, so it mainly feeds on lizards, frogs, as well as field voles and mice and rats. And of course, it's not a falconer's bird, and of course, if you gut and skin a rat, so there wouldn't really be a lot left to eat. So they weren't typically flown by noble people. Then, who flew the goshawk? Now, as I mentioned before, the goshawk was one of the two most common birds of prey that were flown in falconry. Now, the goshawk was flown by the yeoman, and the yeoman was sort of like the farmer, or like a farmer, and of course the yeoman was actually a very lucky man, because the goshawk was known as the cook's bird because of the amount of prey it can catch. Like the goshawk would catch pigeon, duck, goose, partridge, pheasant, grouse, squirrel and rabbits, and even big females could catch things as big as brown hares. So the yeoman would have been able to feed his family with the goshawk. And I've seen goshawks a few times in falconry. Like the first time, because I took this photo in Northumberland a few years ago in 2019. I can't remember the name of the castle, but when I went with my mum, they actually had a falconry stand, and that was actually the first time I saw a goshawk. And then this one here was about 4 years ago at Tewksbury that I saw a goshawk for the second time. Now, goshawks are still used in modern falconry, but as I mentioned earlier, the goshawk is a one-man hunting bird, and it can be quite stressful and it would not cope with a big falconry display. So that's why we use the Harris hawk from North America, but I'll get to that a bit later. So, the kestrel was flown by the knave, the goshawk was flown by the yeoman. Now, the merlin is another falcon, probably a little bit smaller than the kestrel, but even so, this was flown by the ladies of the court. Merlins typically live out on moorland, and they hunt things like insects as big as dragonflies, but they will also eat songbirds like pipits, finches, wagtails, starlings, but of course the biggest bird the merlin will catch is the skylark, and skylark and starling were very popular dishes on a noble's table, and of course the merlin was flown by the ladies of the court, like the princess or maybe her courtiers, and of course they would quite often take their birds out to hunt skylarks or starlings, which is probably where the phrase larking about came from. You'll have to forgive me, I'm going to be repeating a few jokes I've heard from Falconer over the years. Of course. Now, who flew the peregrine? Now, the peregrine, as I mentioned earlier, was flown by two people, the squire and the prince. Of course, the peregrine has always been my favourite animal. In fact, I first came across a peregrine when I was quite little at the Battle of Tintagel in Cornwall reenactment, because of course, the male peregrine, who is a third smaller than the female, he was flown by either the earl or most likely the squire. And that was where it got known as the trice, I think it is. It's an old French or Latin word. But the female, who was a lot bigger than the male, she was flown by the prince, and she was called the Falcon Gentle because the prince was quite often called a gentleman. You're probably wondering what this contraption is. Well, this is actually a contraption used in falconry that was used to carry these 6 falcons at once, and you're probably wondering why the falcons here are wearing hoods. Well, that's all down to... That's probably where the phrase hoodwinked came from, because by putting a leather hood over the bird's eyes, they calm down because they think it's night and won't fly away. So that's probably where the term hoodwinked came from. And this contraption is called the cadge, and that was used to carry about 6 hooded falcons. And Henry VIII was a very keen hunting man, the King of Tudor England. And of course, Henry VIII was a keen hunting man, and he'd quite often take his falcons out hunting, but of course he never carried the falcons himself. Instead he'd get someone else, like a servant or more than likely a knave, to carry it, and quite often he didn't pay you, and you had to do as Henry said, otherwise he would have cut your head off, and he had quite a reputation for that. But other nobles, like a baron, an earl, or even the prince, if they'd hire a knave to carry their falcons for them, if you did a good job at the end of the day, you might get paid, maybe even offered service in the noble's house. But yeah, the peregrine is still used in falconry today, and unlike the goshawk, it can cope around people, like in large crowds. Now, you're probably wondering who was at the top of the falconry hierarchy, and that was the king. Now, the king, because he could fly wherever he wanted, but only the king was allowed to fly the golden eagle and the gerfalcon. Now, the gerfalcon is the largest of all falcons. It's a pure white falcon that usually is found around Scandinavia, northern Canada, around the Arctic Circle. Of course, the golden eagle is a bird that is around in Britain today. Of course, they were the only 2 birds that were that were flown by the king. Well, only the king could fly those two birds. So, as I said, the king could fly whatever he wanted, but only he could fly the golden eagle and the gerfalcon. So, very, very strict hierarchy back in those days. Now, what birds are used in falconry today? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we still use the goshawk, but not for, like, modern day displays. For that, we use this, Harris hawks. Harris hawks are native to the southern states of North America, as well as parts of Mexico. And what's unique about Harris hawks is that they actually work together in packs, because they're known as flying wolves, because they hunt together. And of course, they're also very useful for your first-time falconer. So, if you become a falconer for the first time, they're a good way to get some experience. They're easier to handle. They're easier to look after, and of course, they're easy to train. And of course, we also fly owls, like the barn owl, which is native to Britain, and occasionally I have seen the eagle owl flown in falconry. But of course, I actually held an eagle owl on my hand a couple of weeks back while I was down in Tewksbury, and of course the falconer is this man, the falconer, and I've followed him among reenactors for many, many years now. And of course, was when he said to me that I was allowed, that I could stroke his owl, I was a little bit nervous because I was worried she might take off a couple of my fingers, because the eagle owl is a terrifying bird. And of course, barn owls are actually believed to be creatures that many people were led to believe were the reason for people believing in ghosts and banshees, because barn owls, as I said, are native to Britain. And I was trying to imagine, like, in the medieval era, you're out on your castle battlements at dusk time, the sun's going down, there's a mist along the fields, and then you see this white shape soaring across the mist and giving this loud, hissing, screeching call. Because barn owls don't hoot, they screech, and it's quite possible that this bird is what led people to believe in ghosts and banshees. But also, owls have quite often been associated with witches. Sorry, I'll have to forgive the noise. Anyway, as I was saying, owls have also been associated with witches, because it's quite often been said that witches can turn into owls, and also, if you apparently see an owl fly past your bedroom window with the window open, and then to give a hooting call or screech, it probably means you're going to die. But I tend not to believe any of that kind of rubbish. But yeah, barn owls are another bird we use in falconry today, but of course we don't really use them for hunting, more for like displays. But of course, Harris hawks are used in falconry, and they can be used as hunting birds as well, because unlike goshawk, because they work together in packs, they are very comfortable among arenas full of people. Yeah, well, that was my presentation on falconry, and I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please drop a comment down below, and don't forget to check out my other videos. Okay.